Welcome to Expanding Truth. Today I'm going to be interviewing Dr. Joshua Rasmussen. I'm interviewing him about the principle of sufficient reason. Now, we're going to get into what this is and is it reasonable and questions like that. And I understand that it's a little bit laggy and the audio is not the best, but just remember this is my first interview and I'm literally recording on a Mac. So please bear with me and enjoy. Joshua Rasmussen is assistant professor in the philosophy department at Azusa Pacific University. He earned his PhD in philosophy at the University of Notre Dame. His area of research is in analytic metaphysics, with a focus on basic categories of reality such as objects, ideas, and necessary existence. He's authored several books and has a YouTube channel called Worldview Design. All right, are you ready for your questions?
Yeah, it's good to be with you, Connor.
Yep, good to be with you too. All right, so our first question is pretty simple. It's just, what is the principle of sufficient reason?
Okay, that's too hard. I'm just joking.
Okay.
Well, this principle actually does come in different forms. So the basic form would be something like every fact or everything has some reason or explanation.
Mm-hmm.
So this is sort of like when the kid asks, why is that true? And then you say why it's true, and then they say, well, why is that true? Principle of sufficient reason would say you can always give an answer.
Mm-hmm.
So one version would say either in terms of some cause that produces it, or in terms of the necessity of its nature. So if it is of necessity, that would be a kind of explanation. So that would be one kind of mainstream form of the principle. But there are other variations on the principle.
Okay. All right, so our next question is basically why we're here is, why is the principle of sufficient reason reasonable?
Yeah, okay. So again, it's going to depend on which principle you have in mind. I was actually thinking of posing a little bit of a challenge. So let's just take the strongest principle, which just says that everything has an explanation,
Mm-hmm.
where everything ranges over rocks, planets, universes, all of reality even.
Mm-hmm.
But now there's a certain challenge, because if you say everything has an explanation, what could explain the totality of all that's real? Well, it can't be something external to all that's real, because there's nothing real external to all that's real.
Mm-hmm.
And you might think if it was internal to all that's real, then you have a kind of circular explanation, which isn't really it's not really an explanation, you might think. And so this would actually be a problem for the sort of strong form of the principle of explanation. This is not what you're looking for. You're looking for an argument for the principle, but I thought it'd be good to just sort of start with this sort of challenge against the principle.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you want to interact with that or not, or if you want me to try to respond to the challenge, or kind of what your
you can just
are.
respond to the challenge. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, well, I think that what the challenge does is it points to the value of getting clear the difference between things that have an external explanation and things that don't. So I think that absolutely there can't be an external explanation of all of reality, because that leads to a contradiction. There's nothing real outside of all reality that can explain all of reality. So there's got to be some category of reality that doesn't have an external explanation. And in support of this principle that things would have an explanation, I think you look at observation. You notice that this is how science works. You notice that there's a causal order, and we try to explain our observations, right, with hypotheses.
Mm-hmm.
And so my view is that it's right to explain things as far as you can, and that a reason to think that this is reasonable is that explaining things as far as you can actually successfully predicts what you observe. You observe a causal order. And so this would lead me towards more that mainstream principle that I mentioned, that everything has an explanation, either in terms of an external cause or in terms of its necessity. So reality in its totality doesn't have an external cause. So, I don't think reality in its totality is necessary, but I think that I can account for how there can be a reality in terms of something that's necessary, that it exists because of its necessity, and that it causes the rest of reality to unfold.
Mm-hmm.
If that makes sense.
Yeah.
So that would be one reason in support of the principle, is that this sort of mainstream version, which is that it makes sense of the things that we observe. It's like a hypothesis of explanation that predicts our observations of a causal order.
Yeah. All right, so that kind of leads us to our next question, which is, how would you respond to the claim that if the universe is eternal, then it doesn't need an explanation or doesn't have one?
So first I would want to get clear, what do you mean by universe?
Yeah.
Now maybe what you mean is the totality of everything, right? So
Mm-hmm.
we already just talked about how the totality of everything doesn't have an external explanation
Yeah.
because there's nothing outside of reality.
Mm-hmm.
So in that sense, I would say, yeah, there is nothing outside the totality of the universe if you think of the universe in that way. But if you think of the universe as instead the total of contingent things or material things that don't exist of necessity, well then by the principle of sufficient reason that things that are contingent have a further explanation, there's going to be a further explanation beyond the universe. So I think it is going to depend on how you define the term universe.
Yeah.
Well, I think that the reason that this question is interesting is because often this principle shows up in certain arguments for there being a cause of the universe. And what I'd like to do is just clarify terms. If what you mean by universe is the totality of everything, I don't think there could be an external cause of that.
Yeah.
If what you mean is it's a contingent reality or even a material reality, then I think those sorts of things can have a further explanation. So if you explain things as far as you can, you'll find an explanation of the universe.
Yeah, because Leibniz himself was actually happy to believe in an eternal universe, correct?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, the eternality doesn't explain its existence.
Yeah, yeah.
If you have an eternally old cell phone or something, and somebody's like, why does that exist? Like, oh, it's just always exists. Like, well, that doesn't tell you why it exists.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. That's kind of like William Lane Craig's analogy with the ball in the woods. The one that he uses a lot.
That comes from Taylor, actually.
Oh, yeah,
so
yeah.
he describes the sphere that you find in the forest. And it's like you wonder, like, why is that sphere there?
Mm-hmm.
And somebody says, oh, well, just got there without an explanation. No, that's not what you think.
Yeah.
You might not know what the explanation is, but you're going to think it got there somehow. And if somebody says, well, maybe it's eternally there, well, the age doesn't explain its existence. I think what's actually going on here, Connor, is that the reason people are tempted to think that age is relevant is because the best way to account for how something is eternal is that it has necessary existence. That is to say, it's because it has robust necessary existence that it would always exist, and then that would maybe explain why it exists rather than not. But if it just is an eternal blue ball or whatever, but it doesn't have necessary existence, then it still, I think, calls for a further explanation, something that could account for how it even exists that long.
Yeah, all right. So now the skeptic might say, well, if everything has an explanation, what's the explanation of God? He would have an explanation too, right?
Yeah, right. So this goes back to that sort of original question of what demarcates the difference between the thing that has an explanation and something that would have no further or external explanation. And I think that's a really important question. In fact, I'm doing a video series on my channel on this exact question. The answer that I propose, I actually think there's multiple different answers that are consistent with each other and shine on each other, sort of reinforce each other. So one answer would be that there's a relevant difference between God and a contingent universe. In particular, if God has necessary existence, then that's the kind of existence that doesn't call for a further external, at least not a causal explanation. I do think that you might talk about maybe even within God's own nature, maybe there are necessary elements within God's nature that have a kind of explanatory structure. Maybe we could toy with that. But I do think that necessary existence can provide a relevant difference. And so I think ultimately my view, I think you might know my work, my view is that that actually it's God's perfection that provides the deepest explanation of why God wouldn't have a further explanation. Because I think even if God has necessary existence, if there was something that has necessary existence, I still wonder, okay, well, why doesn't that have necessary existence?
Yeah.
Well, if it's perfect, well, then that would predict its necessity. And if it's perfect, then it couldn't have a further cause or explanation. Precisely because then it wouldn't be perfect if it depended on something else for its existence.
Okay.
Yeah, does that make sense?
Yes. All right, let's see. That's pretty much all the questions I had. Just going to be a short little interview. So,
yeah, that's fine.
Unless you want to talk about anything else, that's good.
Yeah, I would just say that these are big questions, and because they're big questions, people I think can be reasonable and come to different views about how to answer these questions. But here, let me just say that in my experience, if you really investigate these things with an aim towards truth, like that's the thing that you can be responsible for, like what you're aiming for.
Mm-hmm.
Am I going to aim to get to truth, or am I going to aim, let's say, to defend my belief or defend what I hope to be true? That's like a little bit of a different aim. But in my experience, those who really aim towards truth, like that's sincerely their aim, they're more likely to get to more truth than if they don't aim for truth.
Yeah.
And so I would just want to almost like encourage your audience that as you're thinking about what explains the universe, how could God be an ultimate explanation, You don't have to agree with me about the views I've arrived at, but it's almost like I want to just encourage you on your own. It's like you have the power to aim to get to the truth, and when you do that, you will be more successful. Like that is the most powerful way to get to truth, is just through that aim.
Yeah.
And I think people skip past that sometimes. I sometimes miss that. That's the thing that we have control over, is like what we're aiming for. So yeah, I guess that would be my sort of final thought about that.
All right. Well, that's pretty much all. Thank you so much for being here.
All right, it was a pleasure.
Yep.
All right, talk to you later. Bye.
See you.